Xi Jinping has two competing impulses here. I'm sure that there's nothing that he would love more than to unify with Taiwan. It's hard for me to think of something more emotionally resonant for him. On the other hand, one of the easiest ways to risk the regime's survival is to fight a war over Taiwan that doesn't go well.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
And the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry says the death toll in Gaza is now more than 60,000 people since the start of the war.
I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Battlelines. It is Monday, the 24th of November, 2025. When China's top leaders gathered in Beijing's Great Hall of the People last month, the focus wasn't on who was in the room, but who was missing. Photos from the major planning meeting, known as the Fourth Plenum, showed conspicuous rows of empty seats below the bright red curtains and national emblem. Xi Jinping has launched a purge of his top officials. Yet another one. It's something he knows a lot about. Both he and his father were subject to the same treatment in the most brutal terms under Mao Zedong. So, how does a man who himself suffered so badly at the hands of the Communist Party become such a dedicated servant to it? Why does he continue to use the same repressive methods used against his own family? And what is it in his past that allowed Xi Jinping not only to make his peace with Mao's legacy, but to become the most authoritarian leader in China since then? Joseph Torigian, an associate professor at the School of International Service at American University and a senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., has spent the past 9 years researching that question. The result is a book, The Party's Interests Come First. It's a biography of Zhongxun, Xi Jinping's father. Joseph, welcome to Battlelines.
Thanks so much for having me.
Could I get you first to comment on that bit of news that I was just reading out there, the fact that, that they had this big session in Beijing. A lot of people weren't there, and so the suggestion is that the PLA is undergoing another purge. What do you make of that? And is that down to Xi and his style of government, basically?
So Xi Jinping's own father was persecuted by the party on 5 different occasions. And so purges aren't just party history, they're also Xi family history. And one thing that emerges by looking at the Chinese Communist Party is you see a leader who is dominant, but who nevertheless loses confidence in his deputies over and over again. And so one of the things that jumped out at people at this last plenum was that many of the people who were purged were promoted by Xi Jinping himself. And the question becomes why? And I think one answer to that is if you are close to the top leader, you need to be even more careful because he expects you to do even better. And I assume that his disappointment is even greater that he had to give up on these people.
Right. So this is not just a Xi thing; it's a Chinese leader thing, going back to the revolution.
So within the party, you have this habit of leaders interpreting failures and mistakes as manifestations of deeper problems, usually ideological ones. And that for Xi Jinping, I think often he sees political consciousness as key to the party's triumphs, and that also involves whether or not people believe in his own vision for the party. And when people don't line up with that exactly, then he gets rid of them.
I suppose this is almost a Freudian episode, really, in a way, because what the reason you've written about this guy who was Xi Jinping, who was a party functionary himself. No one probably would have written a biography of him if he wasn't Xi Jinping's father, I'm guessing. So the question is, how does the father influence the son, really? Tell us about Xi Jinping. Am I getting that pronunciation right?
Yeah, so the reason I wrote this book was because I thought that for people who look at China, they often describe Xi Jinping as one of the world's most powerful men, but also one of the most mysterious. And so by looking at the world in which he grew up, the milieu in which he experienced because of who his father was, that would be something significant to do. But I think that even though his father wasn't someone like Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping, names that are familiar to anyone who knows anything about China, his father was still revealing about what it was like to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party in the 20th century. So you'll learn something about the family that Xi Jinping grew up in, but I think also if you look at Xi Zhongxun, you'll learn something about ideology, elite politics, ethnic politics. And if there's a through line in the book, I think it's that this was someone who suffered in extraordinary ways for the sake of the cause, but nevertheless remained loyal to it. And for people like us, that might seem hard to believe, but for them, communism wasn't just a way of interpreting class relations. It was a sense of purpose and meaning. And so when the party betrayed you, the inclination was to work even harder to win back its trust, because without the party, you were essentially someone without meaning in your life.
Yeah, and hence the title of the book, "The Party's Interest Has Come First." And you've kind of preempted one of the questions that I wanted to ask, which was, how does, since his own family suffered so appallingly under Mao, why does Xi Jinping seem to admire Mao quite a bit? Which I think you've kind of hinted towards there. Take us back to the beginning. Tell us about the family roots. Where does Xi Zhongxun come from? Where did he grow up? How did he become who he was? And I suppose, who was he? Where was he in his life by the time Xi Jinping is born?
So Xi Jinping was born in Shanxi province, which is where the Emperor Qin Shi Huang forged the first unified Chinese state. Emperors had ruled from the nearby city of Xi'an. Your listeners might know the terracotta soldiers. That's where they're from. And so when Xi Jinping was born in 1913, 2 years after the collapse of the Qing dynasty, this was an area that by then had been rocked by many years of war and famine and banditry. And so one childhood friend of Xi Jinping wrote in his memoirs that it was the kind of place that would lead to extreme thinking, because on the one hand you had this rich cultural legacy, but on the other hand it had been devastated after so many years of state collapse. And so Xi Jinping was interested in communism as a very young person, even though he didn't really understand it. He admitted that. It was this idea that something needed to be done, and this was a solution in his mind that was radical enough to allow China to pull things together and achieve the rejuvenation that he thought the country deserved. And his very first revolutionary act was at 15 years old. He was ordered to kill an academic administrator at his school, and he was thrown in jail. And it was in that jail that he joined the party.
Oh, he did it. He killed his...
It was unsuccessful. Several teachers were poisoned. They put poison in porridge, but the person that they were targeting wasn't affected. Nobody died, and he and some other young people were thrown in prison.
And he was ordered to do this by the Communist Party.
That's right. And even though he wasn't technically in the party at that point yet, just in the China Youth League, and then he joined the party officially while he was in prison. And in fact, the person who was the official introductory figure for him suffered so much in that prison that he apparently suffered a mental breakdown and killed himself in Shanghai just a few weeks later.
Good Lord. So he's come to the cause very young, at the age of 15. What's the family like? I mean, I suppose we kind of think if people get interested in communism quite young, they're quite bookish, probably quite well educated. What kind of background does he come from? What was home life like?
A middle peasant family, so poor, but not as poor as most of the families in this region. But even so, Xi Jinping would later on admit that he was so young reading this material, he didn't really understand it. And then, in fact, the more he read, the less he understood. And so when you read Das Kapital, right, it's not surprising that someone in northwest China, when they were only 14 or 15 years old, would struggle. But people who wrote memoirs about the scene at the time, even though they didn't understand the intricacies of the theory, the idea that something really, really, really different was needed, something that was a completely radical approach was what China demanded, was, I think, what attracted him there. But I'll also say one other thing, too, which was it wasn't communist text that truly inspired him. He even told his son, Xi Jinping, many years later that it was a novel that really spoke to him. And it's a very poorly written novel, and it's a somewhat obscure novel, in part because it is so badly written. But it's called The Young Wanderer, and it's just a series of disasters that befall a young person who at the end decides that only violence can save China, so he leaves to learn military affairs. And When Xi Jinping was released from jail at 15 years old, his father died because of the stress and anxiety of that experience. A mother and 2 sisters also died during this period. He had developed a skin disease so serious he couldn't walk. And this is the novel that he read. And it includes lines like, the more the evil in old society showed me how devastating it was to people, the more that my sense of resistance developed. And so it was this book, it was a cultural product that helped keep him on the path at this moment of desperation. And he told his son that that was the case for him too.
So he sticks with the cause. Just walk us quick. It's a very tumultuous time in Chinese history. There's obviously the Japanese invasion and occupation, there's the war, then there's the Civil War and Revolution. So walk us through that and where he gets to by the end of all that.
Well, just a few years after he was arrested by the nationalists, he was arrested a second time, on this occasion by his fellow communists. And he believed that they were planning to bury him alive. And he wasn't released until the arrival of Mao Zedong and the rest of the central leadership at the conclusion of the Long March. And in fact, Mao didn't know that Xi Jinping and the other communists in Shanxi were even there. He read about them in a newspaper in a dusty old town and set up shop. Until the end of his life, Xi Jinping credits Mao with having saved him. And then we see during the revolution...
Let me get this straight. So he's imprisoned by the local communist leadership for some crime. Was he...
Yeah, so what happened was Xi Jinping was trying to create these base areas away from the cities where they were vulnerable to nationalist attack. And then you had these communists from the cities show up and decide that Xi Jinping and the others weren't radical enough, weren't ambitious enough, and that this was a manifestation of an ideological problem. I'm sorry for using this expression, but rightist opportunists is what they were accused of being.
Rightist opportunists, therefore they had to be buried alive.
So there were also issues of personal political motivations here, so it's always complicated to disentangle those factors.
Okay, but either way, he's arrested, sentenced to death, and then suddenly Mao Zedong shows up with the Communist Army at the end of the Long March.
Correct.
And says, let these guys go.
And that's the birth of the Yan'an base area.
Right. And so that explains perhaps his devotion to Mao from that time on. Okay.
And also keep in mind, right, like Xi Jinping nearly died on the battlefield on many occasions, and many of his friends were killed by the nationalists. And you saw this infighting within the party. And so to go from constant defeats, one after another, to the victory of 1949, for Xi Jinping, for Mao to have led the party to that extraordinary triumph, for him to reject Mao, especially a Mao who he believes saved his life, would have been rejecting himself.
This is really interesting. We don't have time to go through the whole thing, but I mean, he climbs the ranks of the party, and I think gets quite high up. Yes. And then in the 60s, along comes the Cultural Revolution, and the family have a terrible time. And by this point, Xi Jinping is already alive. Can you tell us about that? Because we often hear about this with Xi Jinping, and we know that his family were repressed during the Cultural Revolution and suffered terribly, and he was sent off to live in a cave or something and was reading Faust or something like that. I think it's really interesting to talk about that. Could you just talk us through that and how you think that informed the man who we think is the most powerful man on the planet today?
So Xi Jinping was born in 1953, and his father, Xi Jinping, was purged from the leadership in 1962, which was several years before the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. And so 2 things stand out here. One was that these leading families were very afraid that their own children would not be good heirs to the revolution because they were growing up in this entitled environment. And so the danger was that they would be arrogant and spoiled. And so commonly these families were very strict, but even so, the Xi family was known for being brutally disciplinarian. And Xi Jinping's own mother has written publicly that she thought her husband was too tough on the children. And so the Xi family was particularly strict, and Xi Jinping was purged 4 years before the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, which means that in some ways when Xi Jinping says that he suffered more than most, he's telling the truth. And so some people have wondered whether his preternatural ability to hide his true intentions emerged from the fact that his family was so vulnerable from so long, and that this began at such a young age, especially compared to other princelings. And so when the Cultural Revolution begins, Xi Jinping is 15 years old, and he too is subjected to struggle sessions. It's when they put a dunce cap on your head and they shout things at you and say terrible things to you. And his mother, by the way, participated in those events. He was incarcerated, and he said in the 1980s during an interview that it was so tough he thought he might die. And then in 1969, he is exiled to the countryside. And according to his own account, at the train station in Beijing, everyone else was crying, but he was smiling. And when one of his sisters asked why, he said, because there's nothing here for me. And he admitted later that it was such a traumatic experience that it raised doubts for him about the party, but that because he returned to the CCP as China's only answer to its dilemmas, that his sense of conviction and zeal is stronger than someone who didn't go through that, which raises a somewhat philosophical question, which is what kind of suffering leads to dedication and what leads to alienation. But for Xi Jinping, at least, he says that after this, he wanted to devote his life to preventing another cultural revolution from ever happening again. And so in the context of people accusing him of being like Mao, he has been quite frank about the dangers of radicalism and moving too far too quickly. But he also at the same time says that after Mao's death, the party moved away from struggle and zeal in a way that was dangerous. And so what he says he's trying to do is find a sort of middle path. But of course, that raises the question of what is enough struggle but not too much struggle, because struggle isn't an inherently ambiguous concept. And I think that is why it's so hard for people outside of China to understand what he's trying to do, because you can see in theory how this would work, that you would care about the economy and security and ideology, and that you would have this holistic integration. But in practice, doing all of those things at once is really hard.
So the obvious contradiction there is that he is, he says all that, and yet he is, by far the most powerful leader since Mao. He's the longest serving since Mao. He's subjugated the party to his will. In a way no one has since Mao. In many ways, Mao is clearly a model for him. Here's the question I think that is really, key, actually. So as I understand it, about, say go back 15, 20 years, kind of 2000s China, the whole thing's booming. Skyscrapers are going up everywhere and then being pulled down because they're not big enough and rebuilt, and economic growth is off the charts and so on. And there was almost a sense that, and certainly a sense in the West, or an optimistic sense perhaps, that China was opening up, that along with economic growth would come the gradual switch towards liberalism, even if it's not like formal democracy and so on, and an enriched middle class would demand more freedoms, and so eventually China was just going to be a fairly normal country in a way. And when Xi Jinping comes along, he's thought of largely as the personification of that process, as a technocrat and so on. Turns out he's not. Turns out he's a massively authoritarian Mao light. How did he go from one to the other, and why does he embody that switch? And I suppose another way of asking that is that if it weren't for him, would China have gone down that other kind of more technocratic open path?
Well, there are so many interesting threads to pull on there. One thing to say is that you're speaking to one of the perennial debates about communist systems, which is possibilityhood. Could the Soviet Union have taken another path? Could China have taken another path? How much does it matter that they picked one particular leader? And people were very surprised about the kind of person Xi Jinping has proven himself to be. And it's not just a case of people outside of China being dumb. Even very senior revolutionaries who had been around the block, to put it mildly, thought that Xi Jinping would be a reformer, in large part also because of the historical memory of his father, who was seen as the most liberal, humane kind of figure that the party could produce. And in fact, it took them several years to decide that he was going to be an authoritarian. And so for Xi Jinping, there is a lot that we still don't understand. We still aren't entirely clear about how much Xi Jinping was Xi Jinping when he first became top leader and how much that position transformed him. But there certainly is, at the very center of his worldview, this idea that the West is too cowardly to use force to destroy communism, but nevertheless refuses to coexist with it. And so its policy is something called peaceful evolution. And this is a bugbear that we've seen in communist writings since the 1950s, both in Moscow and Beijing. And the idea is that the West creates incentives so that when a new generation comes to power, they do exactly what you were just describing, which is that they take the country in a new direction. And Xi Jinping thinks that's what happened to the Soviet Union. And so what he wants to do is push the party to think more about struggle, to think more about the dangers that the West represents, and to put the regime on better footing by putting more emphasis on political consciousness, by making sure that the Chinese supply chains are secure, that the world is dependent on China, that they are the ones who are controlling indigenous innovation and all of these new technologies. And so it's a view that emerges out of fear. And I think that has a little bit to do with his own life story. He's repeatedly seen the fragility of political order. He witnessed the Cultural Revolution. He saw June 4, the Tiananmen Square protests. He saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the lessons I think that he took is that you need a strong state, otherwise things just fall apart. And he believes he was reacting to these centrifugal forces in society that were created precisely because peaceful evolution was working, and all of the factors that you just described of China becoming more open and all of that needed to be arrested because it was getting too dangerous.
Good Lord, so he's self-consciously anti-Gorbachev.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think so.
Coming up, what Western leaders need to know about Xi Jinping's upbringing and what it means for Taiwan. Welcome back. You're listening to Battle Lines, and we have in the studio Joseph Torigian, the author of The Party's Interests Come First, a biography of Xi Jinping's father. It's a thick book, this one. Obviously, a hell of a lot went into it. I can't imagine the Chinese system is that keen on people poking around in Xi Jinping's past. So how did you go about researching this?
Well, it wasn't easy. So we were just talking about Xi Jinping and the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of the first warning signs that he was going to be more authoritarian than people hoped was a speech that he gave about the collapse of the USSR. And one of the reasons he gave was that they had lost control of their history. And so in this conversation, we've already talked about how Xi Jinping and his father believed that to be members of the party, you need to sacrifice. And to demand that kind of devotion, you need to tell a story that the party is an organization that moves from one triumph to another and is the only way of organizing Chinese society to achieve rejuvenation. And so if you start talking about mistakes, then you can see why that is a challenge to that agenda. But also, it's very hard for people, even within the system, to know what's going on. So that's why we keep seeing these purges at very senior levels, is because even members of the Politburo Standing Committee are misjudging their situation and making mistakes. And we on the outside often get Chinese politics wrong, even when we're talking to very senior people, because half the time they don't understand what's going on either. And this is not a system where people have dinner parties with each other, because as soon as you start having personal relationships, that's seen as factionalism, and it's a good way of tempting the top leader to do something about you. And so what I did for this book is I tried to be creative about how to find sources, because I couldn't just go to one archive and collect the materials and be done. And so one thing I was able to do is a lot of documents are actually available at Western libraries that have leaked one way or another. I made a list of every time Xi Zhongxun met with foreigners and went to those archives and interviewed those people. I spoke to the Dalai Lama. I went to the Italian Communist Party archives, French Communist Party archives, the Russian archives. And then I also used these materials from within China. And on first glance, you might not take them seriously because they're compiled by official institutions. But once you've spent a huge portion of your life studying this man, any piece of evidence allows you to make a mosaic that, at the very least, maybe approximates what it was like for this person.
Absolutely. I mean, you said you spoke to the Dalai Lama. What did he have to say?
So within the party, you had experts on the economy, on the military, but Xi Jinping was known as one of the leading figures, if not the leading figure, for the party's relationship with ethnic minorities. And so he was deeply involved in ethnic affairs in the 1950s and then again during the 1980s, which are, interestingly, moments where the party cared more about economic growth, finding prominent ethnic minority leaders and working with them as a sort of bridge. And so for Xi Zhongxun, he knew the Dalai Lama both in the 1950s, and then he was the senior interlocutor in the 1980s when there were these conversations between the Dalai Lama's emissaries in Beijing during the 1980s, when there was this moment of possibility that the Dalai Lama might return to China. And so, it's really hard to get a read on Xi Zhongxun because when he met with these figures, he was very charming. But when we look at internal sources, we also see this very hardline element. But at the very least, he does seem to have been someone, relatively speaking, who believed that you could have a different kind of equilibrium with China's ethnic minorities, one based on acknowledging grievances, addressing grievances, co-opting people as opposed to repressing people.
What then do you think he would make of what his son's done in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs?
So in 1981, shortly after Xi Jinping was put in charge of running ethnic affairs, there were protests in Kashgar by Uyghurs, which is in Xinjiang. And he picked up the phone from Beijing, called the local military commander and said, "Don't kill anyone. Find Uyghurs who have respect within their community to go speak to these people and calm them down," and it works. And then over the 1980s, at first it seems like this more open policy is successful. And then you start to see protests. And the party is faced with a question, which is, why are they seeing protests at a moment when Beijing has introduced this softer approach? And so one possible reaction is that when you give people space, then they're human beings and it's normal that they protest. And maybe actually these grievances are worse than we thought. And this is just growing pains. But another view is that, well, the reason that they're doing this now when we have loosened the screws is because they're bad people and they're not motivated by real problems. And so there was this debate within the party. And ultimately, Deng Xiaoping decided that it was a problem of splitists put up to these protests by the West. And in March of 1989, you saw martial law declared in Tibet again. And so for Xi Jinping, he gave this speech that leaked later where he said, what were the first Soviet socialist republics to want to leave and declare independence? The Baltics. What were the most economically advanced socialist republics in the USSR? The Baltics, which means that you can't solve an ethnic problem with economic growth. And so for him, it's a problem not about people's pockets, but what's going on in their heads, their brains, right? Which means you need to change their consciousness. And when you take that to an extreme level, you can understand why we saw these nightmarish concentration camps of
the re-education centers and How's it going down in China?
So
is it in Chinese?
There is not a Chinese translation yet. I'm hoping that there may be one published in Taiwan. But I do want to say that I didn't write the book to air out the party's dirty laundry, so to speak. I'm not writing this book to argue with Xi Jinping, who sees history as moral education. I wrote it to facilitate a conversation for people who want to understand what the party was like to draw their own conclusions. And so if there is anybody in China who disagrees with me and wants to engage with me and tell me I got something wrong, I'm willing to admit that there are mistakes in the book. That's just the cost of doing business with party history. I'll mention that the reason I do the work that I do is because of a British historian named Roderick MacFarquhar, whose class I took when I was a PhD student. He told me about how on one occasion a party historian from China criticized him for getting something wrong, and his answer was, "Of course I got it wrong, I didn't know it happened." And so I'm open to anybody who wants to have conversations with me about the book.
Joseph, thank you very much. I was wondering if you could leave us perhaps with the real crux of this is, how does this help us understand Xi Jinping and what he's going to do next? Is there anything that you think, Western leaders or anybody else who's dealing with him need to know to understand the man? What would it be?
So he's clearly a man with a sense of destiny. He says that what he wants to achieve on the highest level is to break this cycle of one dynasty collapsing after another for millennia by taking Chinese traditional culture and baptizing it continuously in the legacy of his father's generation. He calls this self-revolution. And there's an inherent tension here, right, which is, For his father, he was committed to the revolution because he fought it. Xi Jinping is committed to the revolution in part because he was raised by his father and was inspired by his father. But then the question becomes what you do with the third and fourth generations. And in fact, Xi Jinping has said, quoting Mao, that they are the moment of maximum vulnerability, China's current young people. And so how much this call to rejuvenation and sacrifice and eating bitterness will be meaningful for China's youth, and for how many of them they feel exhausted by economic competition and unemployment and the increasingly closed nature of their society, how this will play out will deserve a lot of attention. And so that's succession at the bottom, meaning young people, and then, of course, succession at the top, meaning what's going to happen within the elite. And Xi Jinping knows just how hard it is to get the succession right because his father witnessed the pathologies there over and over. And he can pick a successor now, and that allows him to test that person to see whether they listen to him, whether they're on board with his vision, whether they're good at their job. But if they fail, then they have to be purged, and that's destabilizing. But if Xi Jinping doesn't pick a successor, that's dangerous too, because if he suddenly dies, well, then you're in a death of Stalin type situation, which can be destabilizing. And you don't get to pick your successor, and who knows who comes next. And as we've been saying today, it's hard to guess what somebody will do when they're the top leader, and Xi Jinping himself is a good example of that.
Does any of your work give you any inkling or understanding of his intentions regarding Taiwan? Will he go to war?
Xi Jinping has two competing impulses here that go in different directions. I'm sure that there's nothing that he would love more than to unify with Taiwan. It's hard for me to think of something more emotionally resonant for him because he thinks that for rejuvenation to be complete, there has to be unification. And he has said that for any Chinese leader to give up on any territory will make them a traitor to 5,000 years of Chinese history. On the other hand, one of the easiest ways to risk the regime's survival is to fight a war over Taiwan that doesn't go well. And so I suspect that for him, to achieve unification, he would prefer to do that in a way that's as least costly as possible, which may mean waiting until the United States seems to be less involved, that China's military capabilities are overwhelming, and then you say to the leadership in Taiwan that you can either have a unification that is good for you or unification that involves force, which will be an even worse deal, and then they get their foot in the door, and then if they need to use force, then it's not as dangerous as it would be otherwise. And so I think the challenge is how to make sure that whenever Xi Jinping wakes up, he doesn't believe that this is the day that he can go because it will be easy, but also that he doesn't conclude that he has to go because he's provoked into doing so because of incautious policies. And I think that is a tightrope to walk that policy, but one that's not entirely impossible.
Joseph Torigan, thank you so much for joining us on Battle Lines.
That's all for today. We'll be back on Friday with our usual end of the week episode. Until then, that was Battle Lines. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph created by David Knowles. If you appreciated this show, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review as it helps others find the show. To stay on top of all our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign on to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine, for latest. You can also get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. This episode of Battle Lines was hosted by me, Roland Oliphant, and produced by Max Bauer. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.